Very good. Hello and welcome to a Taskmaster Talks with Kevin Sullivan, the former WCW and ECW World Tag Team Champion, one of the greatest minds and bookers in professional wrestling. And of course, we are joined today by another one of the greatest minds and bookers in the history of professional wrestling, one of the greatest managers of all time. Kevin, would you like to welcome in our special guest today on the show?
I certainly do. One of my oldest and dearest friends, and what you said, one of the smartest guys I ever met, one of the great bookers, but today, and one of the great managers of all times. But today, John, we're going to go off on a different route to start. People don't understand what a great wrestler JJ was.
Hmm.
And I'll give you two funny little stories. The first time I ever saw JJ, I bought a ticket to go to the Boston Gardens because back in my day, Vince didn't run Boston. Paul Bowser did, a name that people don't know, who was one of the biggest promoters of all times, went from Montreal all the way to LA. He used Killer Kowalski as the world champion. And he was a founding member of the NWA, and he got a dispensation to keep his own champion. So when Bowser passed on and other people ran, Vince finally took over, and Kowalski and Bruno had sold out the Boston Gardens 3 times in a row. And how do you go for a fourth match? Well, you bring in a young, high-cheeked,
Hmm.
slim model manager
A ringer.
and let Kowalski throw a chair at Bruno, and Bruno ducks, and the young man gets hit in the head, and lo and behold, his face is a crimson mask, and they go back and they got the fourth one. We go forward maybe 3 years for the Amarillo office in Tampa had a very good relationship and sent me there for a week. And I think it was El Paso was the first place I started. And there I see that same young, high cheekboned model Adonis smoking a pipe like Sherlock Holmes. And he introduces himself as J Dillon. So I go back a long time with JJ, and I've had wonderful times with JJ. And I think, John, and I may be wrong, James, and you correct me. Aren't we the last two left that sat under Eddie Graham?
Wow. If I'm trying to think outside the circle of you and I, looking for other names, nothing immediately comes to mind. And Eddie, I had heard that Eddie Graham was a genius in terms of the psychology of the business. And of course, I was born and raised in Trenton, New Jersey. So back in the day, when I used to go to Madison Square Garden, I would see Dr. Jerry Graham and Eddie Graham. And anytime that there were any interviews, Jerry Graham was the flamboyant one doing all the talking. And Eddie just stood there very stoic, never said a word. And then, come to find out that that Eddie Graham was, Jerry, I don't want to disparage Jerry Graham, but he was thought of as being a little bit of a goofball, and that Eddie was this true genius in terms of understanding the psychology of our business. So I really wanted to get to Florida and get under the Eddie Graham learning tree, which I finally had a chance to do. And, I had 3,000. A lot of people know me because of the leader of the Four Horsemen, which I'm very blessed to have had a successful managerial career. But I had 3,200 professional wrestling matches. That's how I started. And I started 1981 with Jim Crockett Sr. in Charlotte. And I was 27, going on 28 years old. So I started late. And that's why I knew that if I was going to have longevity in this profession that I love and owe everything that I have to, I realized that I was going to have to look outside of just, a lot of guys would really concentrate on their match and have it be the best it could be, which I did that too. But I looked at the bigger picture. I wanted to know how the whole card was structured, how the matches were placed where they were, how you got the people in the arena. In other words, the importance of television, which in those days drove everything in terms of live arena business. So I wanted to have an understanding of the whole thing. And I became a true student of the business. And not because he's sitting here, I've said it publicly elsewhere, and I've said it to his face too, that I had the good fortune of being around some of the great minds in professional wrestling. Kevin's already thrown out Eddie Graham's name, who had a tremendous influence on me. But another name that I have so much respect for is Kevin Sullivan, one of the brilliant minds in our business. And Kevin, I've learned a lot from you.
And I've learned a lot from you, JJ. And it's funny, I think the only assistant bookers that Dusty ever had was you and me. And I was the assistant to you at one time in Charlotte. So, I mean, one of the things was Dusty kept us both around because JJ is a brilliant guy, and I could understand where Dusty was coming from sometimes. And I would go to James and say, well, how do we keep him on this from stopping? I always use this expression. How do we stop Dusty from painting off the easel? Because he was a genius.
Yeah, he was.
And JJ would say, well, first of all, I can't have the same guy booked in 3 different towns at the same night. So I'll take care of that. Maybe you should kind of indicate that if he's coming back with the same match on top, maybe the heel needs to get his hand raised. So and Dusty was a genius too. I don't think I'm a genius.
Oh, you are. Don't sell yourself short, my friend.
And I know that Dusty was, but the 3 of us got along so well. And I think it was because we were under the mindset of Dusty. And JJ also got a chance that I never had, and I wish I did. JJ got to work for Dory Funk Sr., am I right?
Actually, I worked Dory Funk Sr. I met him one time. Dory Jr. was the NWA champion. And as he toured around, he came into Charlotte. And I had just started in Charlotte in 1981, and it was my first full-time territory as a full-time wrestler. And
right?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I lost a decade somewhere along the way. But when Dory came around, Johnny Weaver, I have so much respect for him too. And Weaver was the top challenger anytime that the Dory came into the Mid-Atlantic area to defend the title. And so they wanted to get a match on television with Dory. And I was told out front, Dory needs to go over. I said, well, I have no problem with that. If you can't lose a match to the world champion, you shouldn't be in the business. And they said that that we had a 10-minute match off of the Raleigh TV, and Dory made me in the match. But I also, gave my best effort, and we had to end up a 10, 12-minute match, wherever it was. And the match was competitive enough that even though I wasn't known in a lot of places, that tape was sent around as a prelude to Dory coming in to defend the title. And I never had a problem with that, because if you can't lose to the world champion, but Dory, knowing that was going to be the case, went out of his way to make me in that 10, 12-minute match, whatever it was.
Right. And James, you said you started in Charlotte. How did you get to Amarillo? Was it because of that match?
Well, because when Dory came in, Weaver wanted to have a match on television. And Weaver said to me, I'd like for you to work with Dory when he comes in on the Raleigh TV, and that that match will be seen everywhere. And a lot of guys, will give you attitude if you're going to, get beat on TV. And I wasn't that way. I understood the big picture. And I said,
Right.
if I can't lose to a world champion, I shouldn't be in the business. And Dory went out of his way in that match. He made me. I put him over right in the middle, but on the way, he made me. He really, really did. And then Dory said, and I had never been, as a kid, I'm born and raised in Trenton, New Jersey. I'd never been south of Richmond, Virginia in my life, or west of probably Pittsburgh. And so when they started talking about going to Amarillo, that seemed like the other side of the world to me. And when Dory came back in I went to the Carolinas, which Jim Grabmeyer set up for me. And like I said, I was almost 28 years old when I got there. And there was the old timers, there was the Johnny Heidemans of the world and the Pedro Godoys. And even though I was a young guy in the business, I was mature. And I had enough sense to know that I had to be respectable to my peers that were much more knowledgeable and experienced than I was. And so every time that there was a chance to sit down and talk about setting up a match, a lot of young guys would right away have a list of what they were going to do. And I was the opposite. And I just said, tell me what you want to do and then shut up. And I got more respect for having that kind of an attitude. And as a result, all these old timers would then go out of their way to make sure that they made me in the match. So I benefited from having that good attitude. And then Dory came in, and I had that match with him on TV for 10 minutes. And the match went over so well that Weaver, who was always the number one challenger, and when Dory would come in for like a week, the two major towns that Joe Murnick had were Norfolk and Richmond. Well, Norfolk and Richmond were only 80, 90 miles apart, and the TVs overlapped. So it was difficult for him to have a world championship match in both towns because it kind of didn't make it special. So I think it was Richmond was the better town. And so in Norfolk, Weaver comes to me and he said, I would like for you to have a world title match on the card, on top, and they loaded the card. Art Nelson was against somebody in a tape fist match. They loaded the card, and they just put me in there based on that 10-minute match that I had on TV. And then I basically did an interview talking about that when I faced Dory Funk, that I was a nervous wreck. He totally intimidated me as hard as I tried not to show it. I was totally intimidated. But when the bell rang a minute into the match, I said to myself, he's great. He's the world. He's everything they say he is, but he still puts his shoes on, his boots on 1 foot at a time. And I'm not in over my head. And that I could prepare for the match because I could watch all of Dory's matches. He doesn't know me from Adam. So that's an advantage to me. He doesn't know what I'm capable of doing. So it ended up, it made for a good story. And I got the main event match. And I had gone 10 minutes with him on TV. And I said, if I could get him back in a 2 out of 3 fall match, I think that would be to my advantage. So they put me in a triple main event. They loaded the card, but because the world title match was considered part of the main event, I worked with Dory in Norfolk.
Wow, that's unbelievable. John, JJ just said something that I'm not sure if you know because you're younger, and there's no disrespect. But back in the day, that was very important when he just said about the TVs overlapping in different towns. And I mean, do you understand what he meant by that and how important it was?
Being it like the TV is going into a different territory, meaning?
No. Norfolk and Richmond were 80, 90 miles apart. So if Dory came in to defend the title and was going to wrestle Weaver in both towns, how do you make that match seem special? And it's like,
Gotcha.
oh,
Gotcha.
this is the, they didn't realize that what was going on in Raleigh, what was going on in Roanoke, because there wasn't that communication and the internet and everything back then. So they wanted to protect the fact that that match in Norfolk or that match in Richmond it was like the world champion is coming in and he's coming into the Mid-Atlantic area, and this is the only match in which he's going to participate. They didn't know he was in 7 towns. And so it worked to my advantage, and Dory made me. And Dory, said to me, privately, he said, I have to be careful when I go around defending the title. My heart's in Amarillo, and I'm always looking for somebody that I know has the right fit for Amarillo and do well. And he said, and you're it. And he said, but I have to be careful of not getting myself in trouble by recruiting talent that are in another territory when I come in. So he told me that when Terry they had a big show in, I think it was in North Carolina. It wasn't Charlotte, but Greensboro. Big show in Greensboro. And so Dory was defending the title, and underneath the World Championship match, Terry came in and Dory Sr. came in for a tag match of support. And so Dory said to me, I'd like for you to come down to the hotel that afternoon. I'd like to introduce you to which I'd never met Terry, of course, never met Senior. And of course, he gave me this unbelievable buildup before they ever saw me. And I got the hard sell about, we don't want to cause trouble by, recruiting people, but we just know that you would do everything that Dory has said. We can see is that and more, and we just know that you would do fabulous in Amarillo if you would come in and have a run, and we would promise you at least 1 and probably 2 trips to Japan, because they were the booking agent for Americans going to Giant Baba and All Japan Wrestling. So that was one of my dreams, was to go to Japan. So that was music in my ears as well.
Now, Kevin, when did you become his assistant? You were talking about that. When did you become JJ's assistant?
I became JJ's assistant.
Let's stop right there. Kevin was never my assistant. He was my whatever the title was, because of the amount of respect that I had for Kevin. And a lot of times I would go to him for advice. And what do we do in this situation? That if I was the head booker or something, it was only out of, I don't know why, but in title only.
No, but this is when Crockett was going to go nationwide, and that's when when Dusty left Florida, and he took about 10 guys. They brought me back to book, and I knew it wasn't going to work, and that's when about 3 months later that Jimmy absorbed Florida. Yeah. And when they did, they brought me up and they put me in the office with James and JJ and Dusty. But you understand now about the overlapping of TV, right, John?
Yep.
Let me just pause for a minute too, because Dusty was my main nemesis in terms of in-ring, across the ring. And I made a lot of money because I was positioned to be in there and either having people in my corner that was challenging him, or I was involved. And I became very, very close to Dusty. And Dusty and Kevin had one thing in common, and that they understood the big picture. They knew who to push, how to push him. And what I brought to the table was that I always was a detail person. That Dusty a lot of times would put together a TV card. He would scribble it on a piece of paper, and his office was next to mine. I shared one with Gene Anderson, and Dusty would come in and he had scribbled down the TV for that. We could throw it on my desk, throw his Gucci bag over his shoulder, go get in his Mercedes convertible, and off he would go. And then I had to take that piece of paper and then look at it. And Kevin already said a lot of times he'd have one guy in two separate matches on there, just because Dusty was a big picture guy, and there was a lot in there. That was the meat, and then I had to go in there and do the detail stuff, move some people around, some things around, and I have always said, and I'll say it publicly again, that I could never have been what Dusty was, the same as I could never have been what Kevin Sullivan was. They were so successful, and what I brought to the table was the attention to detail to make the end story, the end picture, the best it could be. I could never do what Kevin Sullivan did. I can never do what Dusty Rhodes did.
Well, he's saying that, and I don't want to sound like this is an ass-kissing program the whole time, but usually when you're really creative, you can get off the easel quite a bit because you sometimes overthink. And you don't get into detail because I think you become a little bit psychotic because you're trying to think about these big angles. You need somebody like JJ who is both. He's very, very creative, but his main thing was he could organize stuff. So he's selling himself.
Not to interrupt you, but to take your thought, there was always tension between Dusty and Ric Flair because Rick was from the Carolinas. I mean, that's what launched his career. He became from there one of the greatest, if not the greatest champions of all time. But what would happen is that Dusty, the one thing that they would say about Dusty is that Dusty has to go over every night. And with Flair, he would go to Jimmy Crockett or he would go to Jimmy Crockett and say, "Oh man, business is good now, but it's short lived. We're going to die because Dusty's ego is out of control. He's beating me every night. After he beats me a couple of times, what's left?" And so, I would get with Jimmy Crockett. And because I would hear Rick in the locker room on our side, and then I would hear Dusty on the other side too, because I had a good personal relationship with Dusty. So I understood the big picture that we had to have balance. And it was hard for me to go to Dusty and rein him in just because that's not how our relationship was framed. What I could do was go to Jimmy Crockett and say, "Jimmy," and this is not something I would do every week. Excuse me. It's not something I would do every week. It would be maybe once every 6 months that all of a sudden that I'm hearing Flair in our dressing room every night talking about, "Oh, our business is going to go down the toilet. Dusty's beating us. He's beating us, his ego. And once he beats me, how are we going to get the heat back?" So I'm having to listen to that. And then Rick would, kind of say, "Well, can't you talk to him?" And I didn't want to say, "Yeah, I can, but no, I can't." My relationship was not such to Dusty that I could sit him down and so I had to do it in a subtle way to go to Jimmy. And about every 6 months it would happen, maybe a little bit longer sometimes. But I'd say, "Jimmy, can I have a couple minutes of your time?" And he'd say, "Yeah, come in, close the door." And the conversation would stay just between him and I. And I would tell him, because I'm in the dressing rooms every night, that I can hear what Flair is saying. I can see what's taking place. And the situation was about to boil over. And business was so good that we needed to figure a way to try and keep balance. And so I would go to Jimmy privately. Jimmy would tell Flair, say, "Rick, come on over to the house tonight for dinner." And that was a big deal to Rick to have Jimmy and Myra have Rick over his house for a dinner. And then he could have a private conversation with Rick. Jimmy also could go in with Dusty, close the door with Dusty, and he knew how to have a conversation with Dusty that no one else was there. Jimmy was still the boss. He was the guy signing the checks. So Jimmy, in his own way, could kind of address some things with Dusty that nobody else could. And Dusty never knew, the same as Flair never knew, that I was talking to Jimmy, had a great relationship with Jimmy, and then Jimmy would then, he knew what to tell Flair, bring him over the house, have dinner. Rick would, he'd come to the dressing room and say, oh, last night he said it was like old times. Jimmy had me come over his house for dinner. And oh man, and he would be good. And then Jimmy knew how to talk to Dusty too. And, stroke Dusty in the way that he could have. And it was an unbelievable run that we had for a couple of years.
Here's something. I wish I had read Dusty's book before he passed, because JJ and I love Dusty, and you know what he's talking about, how he had to go over there and smooth things out.
Mm-hmm.
You could get on Dusty's bad side, meaning JJ or me, very easily if you approached him and it was like he thought it was a personal affront. It happened to me a lot. It happened to James a lot. He was very sensitive on a lot of issues. And I think the way James would handle things, and that's the other reason. Maybe Dusty didn't outwardly know what James was doing for him, but he could tell that somebody was talking. Dusty was no fool. He would figure it out. It was James, because Rick would cool down. I was there that era, and I was in the heel dressing room, and I was hearing that every night. And I would look at James, and he'd be just taking it in. I could see the wheels turning, but he wasn't going to go over and tell Dusty, and I wasn't going to go over and tell Dusty, because James and I had a bond that what we heard stayed with us. And it was the only thing difficult about Dusty was walking around him and walking on eggshells sometimes and keeping him on the right track politically, because there was a bit of a rivalry for years, and I don't mean just a little rivalry, with him and Flair about the belt, about Rick being a great performer, but Dusty being the great mind. And there was I feel, do you feel that, James? There was a little bit
Yes.
of a competition amongst them.
Oh, absolutely.
And Jimmy Crockett probably had to do the same thing with Dusty once in a while, calm his ass down. So,
Yep.
I mean,
And he could do it because he was signing the checks. I could not go in and say to Dusty what Jimmy would.
And you have to have a guy like James that knows how to bridge personalities. But it's so much different now, because everybody's on a contract and they know what they're going to get. I mean, guys, if back in the day, if you were working with someone and you found out that he got $100 more, there was shit to be paid. I mean, there was bull. I mean, and they would do it. You know what I mean? They would take care of guys. I mean, they knew. And Eddie had the greatest work to make you feel like you were important. You get your check, and Monday would be West Palm. We'll say, John, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was $200, and then next to that it'd say plus 100. Tampa, 250 plus 50. You thought your worth was the match you had delivered. He was just making you feel like you were special, and that's what he did. And that's one of the things about Eddie, was he could make people feel very special with his presence. And I think Dusty learned that better than anybody, much better than Watts. That was the only other guy I thought about after you and me. because Bill had a whole different attitude. But Dusty could charm a dog off a meat wagon when he wanted to.
Yeah, and I miss him. He was, I he was a business associate. He's somebody that I made a lot of money because I was the right place, the right time. But he was also my friend. And back in those days, you hear kayfabe. Well, as close as I was to Dusty, we could never. It was a rare occasion, like at Christmas. Dusty would have a big party at Christmas at his house, and he and Michelle would make sure I was invited. And if there were some people there that it would be awkward to have us both there, he would wait till they were weeded out and the people that were there were okay, and then Dusty would bring me in, and because he wanted me there, that was how close we were. And every year I would get a nice present from he and Michelle, and I had a great relationship with Dusty. I had so much respect for him, and I said I could never do what Dusty did, the same as I could never do what Flair did. But I was like a juggler. I juggled the balls, and my job was a detail person to take their story and make it be the best it could be.
And JJ, you'll remember this. People that said Dusty never did jobs. We did this angle when I left Florida and I went to Charlotte, and I got on the bad side of Dusty because I didn't handle it right. And I quit Charlotte. I think it's the only time I ever quit anywhere. I quit. And Dusty called me and said, "Hey, we want you back." And we did this very famous angle where it was, "This is your life, Dusty Rhodes." It was his 20th anniversary being the American Dream. And shoot telegrams came in from George Steinbrenner, Willie Nelson, all this. And we had his supposed sister there. And his sister came out and hugged him, and all the baby faces came out. And I came in like Jack Ruby, and I had been gone for 3 months. And I had grabbed the ink, and I threw it at Dusty because he was signing for Flair, with the old quilt pen. And I threw the ink at Dusty. He ducked, and I blinded his sister. And I left. And I was suspended from Florida. And Dusty said he would refuse to wrestle for 2 weeks, and he did until they brought me back. And that night we went to Lakeland, and it was sold out. They actually were turning people when they're getting off the interstate, said, "If you don't have tickets." And I remember James saying, he's got to put you over. And I'm thinking, boy, this is a huge house. And he did the right thing right in the middle of the ring, and we were off and running again. And Dusty knew his character as well as Hulk Hogan knew his.
Yeah, and another important point was that, and I can speak for myself and speak for you, that our relationship with Dusty was such that he trusted each of us individually and trusted us together. And there weren't very many people, and it wasn't, the business was such that that trust was not something that happened in a lot of times in a lot of places. So Dusty could give us some extra rope, knowing that we were never going to take advantage of it and have it backfire on him.
Right. So
now, as far as Dusty, Dusty the worker and everything else, when you guys are, doing details and stuff and working for Dusty, give me kind of an example. I know you were kind of saying that he'll put two guys on one card, but give me like an example of something where maybe he did something, you had to correct his booking, like a real solid example of maybe not a screw up, but something that you guys had to lend a big time help to him.
Well, when he would do TV, he would write down, matches, just written on a piece of paper, and then he would come in with his Gucci bag over his shoulder. Here's TV, and throw it down. And because I was in the office right next door with Gene Anderson, and then I would get it, and I never confronted Dusty to say, "Hey, what were you thinking?" It never became a thing between him and I, because my role was not to somehow convince Dusty that he wasn't as smart as he thought he was. I wanted him to know that he was smart, and that my job was not to do anything but to do the details to make him be the best that he could be. And that's why I survived in the business as long as I did. I mean, everybody has to have an ego, and I guess I probably did too, but it wasn't that I had to have people know that maybe the end result was my doing and not Dusty's. It was Dusty's TV. I cleaned it up. And as long as the end result was a positive thing, that was my my job security. And Dusty trusted me just the same as he trusted Kevin.
Yeah, and what he's getting at, John, your question was, did he ever screw anything big up? No, because what James is saying was, Dusty knew what angle he was going to shoot on that main event on TV, or when he was going to get jumped from the Four Horsemen.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe on the first and third match, he has two heels that are going to go over in the first match on TV and in the third match on TV, and he's got the same enhancement guys working with both of them. That's what James is saying. He was cleaning up details. I think knowing your weakness is the most important thing in the wrestling business. And Dusty, and I think I'm the same way. My weakness is detail. James is organization and detail, which is the most important, because, okay, if James didn't clean up that TV, you're short guys for television because you've booked one guy in two matches. That can make the booker look like an idiot.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing too was, I would look at the TV and I could tell, you know, you go to one guy and you'd say, how much time do you need for your cue for your finish to go home? Oh, I just need 45 seconds. Well, I soon learned that the 45 seconds was actually 3 minutes. And so once I knew, as a courtesy, I would ask him, but then I already knew that I would have to send Gene or whoever the cue was out there based on my timetable. So, and it wasn't like there was nothing for me no advantage to me to say, hey, you told me 45 seconds and you told me that same thing last week and it was 3 minutes. So that wasn't what it was all about. My job was not to make a point of the little things that I took care of. I just took care of them. That was my job security, to know that everything was running smooth. And then as a result of it, Dusty, Flair, they trusted me because it never got thrown back in their face about that they did something that shouldn't have happened, that I fixed it. If I fixed it, it was
fixed.
It just was fixed.
Yeah. Well, let's just get back to one thing, James, about your wrestling career. So you went to, I'm assuming you went to Amarillo after you had the talk with the Funks.
Actually, I was brought into Charlotte by Jim Grabmeyer. They booked me sight unseen. And when he called me, he says, well, and I'd been a heel basically around Pittsburgh wrestling part-time. And when I got there, they said, well, we're really desperate on the babyface side. I said, I'll do whatever you want me to do. and they put me together with Les Thatcher, and I worked with Sandy Scott, and I ended up having a 2-year run there. So, like I say, when Dory came in, I made an impression to him because I worked with him on TV, and then he told me, he said, when you're done here, he said, don't be worried about making a phone call looking for another place to go. You're coming to Amarillo when the time's right, and we'll be ready for you. And you're going to get 1 and probably 2 trips to Japan out of it. So I never had to want for a place to go after that, because my jumps were, and I could go in, and when I did come in, it took me a little. I wasn't a gym rat. I didn't walk into a door and somebody say, "Oh wow, who's that?" I didn't command that kind of attention. So when I came in, it took me a while longer to get over. But once I got over, I stayed over for a long time. Other guys would come in and they'd have to leave in 6 months just because that was the pace that everything happened. With me, my moves were all over a year plus, which when you're having to change locations and go somewhere and you got kids in school and you got deposits to pay on rent, if you go somewhere and knowing that you're going to be there for a year, life is a lot better.
Yeah. James, after Amarillo, where did you go?
I think I went to Kansas City and then to Florida. Florida is where I wanted to get to. But
before you got to Florida, did you go to the Maritimes too?
I went to the Maritimes right out of Charlotte. And what was good there was it was a summer territory in the Maritimes, and they would have a monster heel come in every year. The Beast was one of the brothers, and they had Killer Carl Krupp the year before me, and then before that was Archie Goldie, and they had these big, rough monster type of guys. And when it got ready, I forget who it was that they had. I was actually figured in every year. Freddie Sweetan would be a perennial tag champion with a fresh partner every year. So the summer that I was going from Charlotte to the Maritimes, I was figured in as a tag team partner for Freddie Sweetan for that year, and I forget who it was that was supposed to have the top spot. And about 10 days before the season opened, Vince McMahon called the guy that they had figured in to be their top heel, and gave him a starting date for New York. Well, that threw their plans right out the window, and they weren't going to call Vince McMahon and say, "Hey, we had this guy lined up. You're stealing from me." No, they knew better that they couldn't do that. So I was traveling. Leo Burke was working in Charlotte right up to the beginning of the season. So we're making we made a road trip together, and I said to him one day, I said, you've had all these parade of guys that drew big money up there. You had Carl Krupp, and before Krupp, you had the Archie Goldie, and one Japanese guy. And I said, you've had all these marks because that's what you've educated the people to, and it's worked because you're only doing it for just for approximately 5 months. But I said, now you had this big guy lined up to come in, and the rug got pulled out from under you, and now what are you going to do? And you had me figured in to come in as Freddie Sweetan's tag partner. I said, just let me throw an idea out there. I'm already committed to come in anyway. I'm going to be there. I said, what if you changed the formula and went with a guy that wasn't a monster guy, that was because I was tall and I looked bigger in the ring than bigger than what my weight would actually be if they had a scale there. And I said, if you had a guy that was a wrestling heel, they wouldn't fight the Beast like these other guys would. And I threw that out there, and they called Rudy Kay was the brother who ran the territory and was one of the partners, and ran it by him. They said, JJ's coming in as Freddie Sweetan's partner. We lost our top heel. he just threw an idea out. He wasn't, I mean, he's already coming in there anyway. And he just said, what if you change the formula one year and instead of a monster heel, went with a guy that bragged that like he thought he was better than everybody else, but he wasn't an overpowering monster heel. And when his back was against the wall, whether it was go in the tights and take a gimmick and Sunday somebody. So Leo has that conversation with Rudy. And he comes back, make a trip with him next day. He said, I talked to Rudy, and Rudy said, oh, yeah, okay. And he said, I said, well, it was just an idea. No big deal. I'm coming anyway. I'm Freddie's partner. The next day I make a trip with him. He said, Rudy called me back. And the more he thought about it, he said, there has to come a point where the formula that we've been so successful with, we can't count on every year having another monster heel that's going to come in, that he's got to basically top what the ones that previously were here did. And he said, if we changed the formula and went with the wrestling heel, then where the Beast was the end of the line, the Beast is the first one, and he's the one with the title that you got to take from. And instead of beating the Beast down, he beats the hell out of you, and then you take the gimmick, knock him out with a. I had a piece of chain from a snow tire that I carried and hit him and took the title from it, and it was like shock. And so now Leo Burke and Bobby Kay and all these other guys then were lined up that I wouldn't fight them. And the Beast started getting the best of me. I'd roll out, take a walk, take a powder, get him back in here. Come on, you chicken shit. And it was just a different style. And I got unbelievable heat. And it ended up that it was the best season that they ever had, which worked good for me because then when it came time to go to Amarillo, all of a sudden, here I'd been a babyface in Charlotte for 2 years. I was due to be a tag partner as a heel, and then all of a sudden, their top heel got a call to go to New York, and they decided to give me a chance and had the biggest summer that they had ever had. And so that made that springboarded my reputation to go everywhere from there.
James, I wanted you to tell that story without telling you why, because James and I have traded thousands of stories, but I learned a lot from that story he told me, and the learning process for me was, do not fall in patterns.
Yep.
And if James and I were honest and look back at, that's what Eddie did, but he didn't tell you. But after Briscoe, think about this, John. Jack Briscoe was, to me, the most ultimate baby face of all times. Handsome.
Mm-hmm.
He had the credentials, the Olympics.
Yeah.
Everything. How are you going to follow Jack Briscoe? Dusty Rhodes. Those are the two big. I mean, they followed. One was 1A, 1B, or 1A, 1A. They just followed one another. Eddie didn't try to make a Jack Briscoe. He did for a little while with Don Morocco. When they did that thing where Morocco actually came into a match as Jack Briscoe, but he knew it wasn't going to work.
And he had Hiro Matsuda too, that was always kept a good solid foundation of legitimate wrestling too.
Yeah. So he went a different way. James, when I broke in the business, I did some research before he came on. Like you said, the Maritimes. There were two offices in the Maritimes, right? There was Emil Dupre.
And Emil he didn't want TV, and he didn't want the financial risks of going big. He was happy to have the small towns, and made a good living doing that.
Yeah. When I broke in the business, John, there were 37 individual companies.
Yeah.
JJ, when you broke in, and there was in Texas, there was Amarillo the Funks. Had Fritz taken Dallas, or Ed McElmore still have Dallas?
Fritz had taken it, and then Joe Blanchard had San Antonio, Corpus, and San Antonio. You actually had like 3, and Paul Bosch had Houston, and Houston was your big money town. But if you went in there, the perfect situation was if you were figured in on one of the 3, boy, that's not such a good thing. Or if you were figured in 2, it was, well, that's a little bit better. The ideal situation was to be figured in by Fritz in Dallas, Joe Blanchard in San Antonio, and Paul Bosch in Houston. And I went in with Archie Goldie, and thank God I had, and it just worked out for me that we were figured in all 3 places. And then Archie Archie was, God, he was a wonderful guy, but he was his own worst enemy. He would, you'd ride in a car with him and he wouldn't talk for a long time, and then things would be going good, and he would get into a conversation that it's like, oh, well, I says, I could see they don't have any plans for us. And his safety parachute was he could call Stu Hart in Calgary, and Stu Hart would tell him, get in your car and come up here. You're working the next night. And that was always this thing where he could go somewhere, be on top, and make good money.
I'm going to interrupt you, James, because I knew Stomp and Archie very, very well. Okay, I helped to get him his job in the business on the sheriff's department in Knoxville. Now that I've learned some stuff about mental illness, don't you think that Archie was bipolar?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean,
I didn't know. I didn't know what it was at the time, but the answer is yes.
Yeah. John, he had extreme highs and extreme lows. I knew him. I mean, he'd come in the dressing room and he'd be a ball of energy, happy as anything, and extremes. I mean, he ate millet. Do you know what millet is, John?
No, never heard of it.
Cereal like oatmeal, right? They feed it.
Okay.
Well, they used to use it for long distance runners. Archie ran a marathon eating just millet for 6 months. I mean, and he was like 240 and shredded. But Archie would go into a dressing room, and God rest his soul, he was a wonderful human being. But then he'd come in, like I said, and light up the dressing room for a month. The next month, he wouldn't say a word to anybody. So
weird.
Yeah.
And I had met him in, I went in as a wrestler into Florida, and Roger Kirby and I were tag champions, and Archie was in there, and Archie left to go to Tennessee with Bearcat Wright as his manager. If you were around Bearcat and Archie, you would know that was a relationship that was doomed from day one. It was just a question of how long it was going to last and how big it was going to blow up. And so that's what happened. Archie left, and with Bearcat as his manager, went to Tennessee, and it wasn't, it wasn't 6 weeks later. Archie calls me, and he said, this was a disaster. I should have known. And he said, Bearcat got mad and walked out. And so I just stood there. He never talked. And he said, now I had to talk and do my promos. And he said, it killed me. I have to leave. So he said, I had never managed at that point. I had been a wrestler. And he said, I called around, and he said, I talked to Red Bastine, who was Fritz's booker in Dallas. And he said, I can walk in and I have a main event spot guaranteed to me, but I need a manager. And he said, have you ever managed? And I said, no. And he said, well, I've heard your interviews. I am confident that if you went in as my manager, we would blow the place apart. And I said, well, I'm willing to try anything. And once I said I'd have to go out and back then you could get leisure suits, and I did, And so I said, let's go for it. I had never managed. So I went with Archie, and we got to Texas, and Archie, it's like Kevin said, he would be his own worst man. And he would, after a little bit, he'd say, they got no plans for us here. And he would call Calgary, and Stu would say, well, get your car and come on up. You're booked tomorrow on top. And that's what he did. And then all of a sudden, Red calls me, and he says, Red Bastien calls, and he said, I can't find Archie. He said, he's not answering his phone. And I said, well, I don't know. I said, I'll go by the house and talk to him, see what's going on. So I go to the house that Archie had rented, and I'm looking in the windows, and all I'm seeing is no furniture and bare floors. And it's like, oh. And I called Red, and I said, Red, I said, I don't know where he is. He didn't tell me anything. He said, but he's not there, and I got a feeling he's gone. So panic set in, and what are they going to do? And so Lonnie Main had been in Portland or Frisco, and he was, Lonnie was just, he was a character of all characters. So he said, Red said, he said, it's important because a lot of the heat was on me. And he said, I need for you to assure me that you're going to stay. We'll find you the right guy. And they got Lonnie Main to come in. And so they put me with Moon Dog Main. And then there was some other guys after that. And they wanted me to stay. And it worked out because they said, you're carrying the heat. And so it's going to get somebody over a lot sooner if you bring somebody else in and kind of have a stable type of thing. So again, I survived. I dodged another bullet, and but Archie's Archie, and he's still a friend. If I saw him, I'd give him a hug and made money with him. And it's just a business. Kevin could say that's the thing of, I guess it's one of the unique beauties of the business, that there are all kinds of people, all kinds of personalities.
Yep.
Now, as far as both of you guys, I know we talked a little bit about the Four Horsemen and Dusty and Flair having a little issue. You guys ever go out to the bar with Ric Flair and the Four Horsemen? JJ, I know you have. Kevin, have you partaken in any extracurricular activity with the Nature Boy?
Yeah, and some the Nature Boy exposed in his book, and I'm still paying for it. Yeah, I mean, I got to tell you a funny. Yeah, I went out with them, but I got to tell you a funny story. JJ was the consummate rum and coke guy. A lot of guys drank beer, a lot of guys drank vodka, but JJ's drink was rum and coke. JJ got.
Oh, Kevin cut out for a second. While we're waiting for Kevin to jump back in, JJ, why don't you give us an awesome Ric Flair drinking story?
Oh my goodness. It was like, I can't count the number of times Rick put Rolex stock. If I had stock in Rolex, while Ric Flair was on the road, the Rolex stock had to go sky high because of the number of Rolexes that Ric Flair bought. His wife gave him a nice Rolex, and then Rick would go out on the town, and he'd get up in the morning, and I can't count the number of times where I'd get on the elevator, and the girl that Rick had been with the night before gets on the elevator, and she's wearing Rick's Rolex. I said, God, that Rolex looks familiar. I said, that's Rick's. It's engraved. Let me see. Yeah. So what are you doing with this? Oh, I forgot I had it on. I was, so I don't know how many times I saved them and how many times that I was in the right place at the right time that Rick had to go buy another one so he didn't go home without his Rolex, and no story about why he didn't have it.
Yeah. But
now, Kevin, what was that story? Yeah.
Okay, I'll tell you. So JJ had gone to Africa on a safari. So like all of us, after a show, we used to have to like to throw them down. So I go do you know Rush Street in Chicago, John?
Heard of it.
It's
Never
right.
been there though.
It's right off the Great Lake. It's freezing cold. We got a show at the end of December in Chicago. So I don't know how, but JJ got to the bar before me, and I
There's
want
a place. There was a place called Snuggeries. I'm sure it's changed hands. God knows how many times, but that was our water hole.
So he's in Snuggeries, and I look
Hmm.
over, and I see JJ, and I'm warming up, and I'm watching him, and he ain't drinking. The glass is still 4/5 full, and I know he should have 3 of them down by now, but I know that's the first one. And he tells me about. He says, "I just don't feel right. My stomach doesn't feel right." And I said to him, "Well, when you're on that safari and you ate out of that cast iron bowl, what kind of parasites do you think were swimming in that bowl that are now swimming in your bowels?" We got to laugh on that because JJ, he was the leader of the Four Horsemen. Rick was the entertainment, but JJ was the leader. And I couldn't believe, anything could bring the Four Horsemen down. But that particular night, if you remember, James, we went back to the General's Hotel. Was it the Blackstone?
Oh, the
It was one of
bridge.
the people that owned the Blackhawks, and they
Yep.
owned
The hockey team,
They owned,
the
they
basketball
were
team.
the only, yeah, and they were the only individual family ever taken to court by the U.S. government for monopoly. Every prize fight, world champion prize fight, from 1935 to Ali's era, was fought in a building they owned. So we used to
And
stay at the hotel.
the son went to prep school with Rick. That was the
Right.
connection.
Yeah. So we used to stay in a suite. So we're all staying there, and we're coming. And that night, Aaron's with us, and Aaron's saying, "I got to get home. I got to get back to the hotel early because I'm flying to Hawaii in the morning, and my wife and I and the family are going on vacation." This is the funniest thing I ever saw.
She's flying to Vegas, and I'm going to meet her in Vegas, and then we're getting the same flight from there to go to Hawaii.
Yeah. So one drink leads. Oh, I'm gonna go. Oh, hey, let's have another one. Double. Blah blah blah. The next thing is, Rick got the limo. We all pile into the limo. We get up to the suite, and everybody has a room. We lay down, and as Iron's head hits the pillow, the phone rings for his wake-up call.
Wake up call.
Oh, you look like he looks like Gleason in The Honeymooners when he got up. His arms were shooting out. He was slipping. He was full of grease. He didn't have time to a shower. Oh, we our asses off. I mean, the good thing about it is we've been serious about this, but there was a camaraderie on the road there, and guys would do little shit to rib each other, right? I'll tell you a funny one. The Big Boss Man, God bless his soul, one of the greatest talents I ever worked with. So I had been a heel in Florida and never really turned babyface. So they had turned me babyface when they Crockett spotted and brought me in for Florida. So I'm working with Ray Trailer, and I always work with big men in Florida, from Blackjack to Andre to Billy Graham to Barry to all of them. So Tully, and I think James was in on it. Tully, Art, and James ribbed him up and said, "He ain't gonna sell a thing for you, you know." So it was in St. Pete. I come out of the building and he's in the ring. I mean, I come out of the dressing room, he's in the ring. I come down. do my stick, and I grab a chair, and it was a big, heavy chairs, John, with the soft seats that are really heavy, and I was pretty strong at the time. I flung that before I got in the ring at him, and he reached up, and he'd been up all night. He reached up and just grabbed it with one hand. I said, holy shit, I'm in it for a tough night. I turned around, and there's the Three Stooges' heads sticking out the door, watching this. They know I'm going to get an ass whipping, right? And they're enjoying it. But it was like that kind of stuff. It was everybody sort of got everybody got along with one another. There wasn't that much jealousy, and if there was, the guys were weeded out. I mean, it was like being on a athletic team. It really was. You know what I mean? There'd be a little bitching, but not much. You know, and a lot more fun. I mean, it was great. It was great. It was a great. And the other thing is that JJ brought up, and I was going. I think I brought up one other time on the show. We could travel across country. We could finish in San Francisco, and if we were going to go to Amarillo, we would drive down to LA and be booked for that night, and drive over to Arizona and be booked the next night before you even got to Amarillo. There was so many places to work. I think more guys back then made a good living. Didn't become multimillionaires, but they made a good, stable living.
I remember the one trip we flew to Vegas, and then from Vegas, a short hop over to Frisco, a short hop over to LA, and we were back there every night in Vegas.
I'll tell you the story on that one. This is when I knew things had gone a little haywire, John. We all go out, right? And we get up. We're coming in. Bars open all night. Coming in, and we're going to leave at noon. It's like 9 in the morning. And as we're passing the pool, the two pilots are in the pool with a bunch of girls having cocktails. I said, oh, this doesn't bode well. Because I went down in a plane one time. I said, oh, Jesus Christ, this is horrible. I mean, that was the atmosphere around the Four Horsemen. I mean, people that never touched alcohol, after 3 days, they were bellying up to the bar with them.
And the thing was, there was a camaraderie among us that it's either genuine or it's not. You can't contrive it. You can't. And it just was a magical time in the business. And like Kevin said, business was good. We were making money, and so everybody was in a good frame of mind. Right. When everybody's making money, it's amazing how the mood, can be very uplifting.
JJ, what about your time in WCW? I know, Kevin, we had Eric Bischoff on the other week. We had a lot of great things to say. We're always talking about the booking of the NWO. But JJ, what do you think about your time in WCW?
Oh, it's kind of a blank. I don't remember. There's very few times in my career where I had to didn't have a place to go when I was making a move, and Tony Schiavone was there at the time, and that was my connection to get there. And I'd never met Eric Bischoff, and I had heard that Bischoff had been in Minneapolis, and he had been basically somebody who was Vern Gagne's, I don't know, it sounds like I'm putting him down, but I don't mean it that way. But he was like his errand boy. And so he got the job, and based on the fact that he sold himself as somebody who was the genius behind Vern Gage's success in Minneapolis. And they didn't know any different. And he was very, very good in terms of dealing with people with suits on that were not, wrestling people.
What did you think about Kevin when Kevin's the booker? Like, did you guys have a relationship? Obviously, it goes back years, but were you friendly with him when you entered WCW and started working there?
I always had respect for Kevin. And I remember I had an office, and who was it that was booking then? And
Russo.
Bischoff, yeah.
Russo.
Yeah. And he sold himself a bill of goods to Bischoff. And I remember you came into my office one day and closed the door. And when you said James, and and it was like, we got a big problem on our hands. And it was like these two factions that the one, had total knowledge of wrestling, that they should have put everything in their hands and we'd had business running good. And the other people, it was all about politics, and we were on the outs, Kevin and I, and there was a woman who came in, I can't remember her name, that was from the music industry, who was a lawyer that was doing all the contracts, and Bischoff knew all the right things to say to her, and she would come into my office one day, and it just, and I remember with Kevin, I knew that they were going to screw Kevin around, and not only because I didn't want to see Kevin end up on the short end, but that I knew he was an important asset, and so I pushed to get Kevin's contract, get him a deal, and get it signed before anybody, once it's signed and everything with the suits, once you had a contract, you were good. And I think Kevin told me he got paid for a couple of years after you left.
3 years. 3 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
And
Kevin, you can thank JJ for that.
Yeah, I have. I went in his, I remember the talk. I went into his office, shut the door, and I said, "Have you seen what's going on?" I said, "This is this is the start of a soap opera that someone's going to sell called the Rope Opera." I was right. You couldn't have come up with what was going on. Now, I'm not going to take anything away from Russo, but I think there was other agendas going on there. Ed Ferrara had come from television. He wrote Honey, I Shrunk the Kids TV show. And I mentioned this to you off camera, John. Everybody, when Dusty won the world title, a lot of people bitched that he was the booker and this shit. I never hear anybody bitch that Russo won the world title. I said to James, this is, I said, "Do you feel the water coming in yet?" He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "We're in the Titanic and we hit the iceberg and it's getting cold on my feet." James said, "Well, I'll take a look." And he came to the show that night.
Oh my God, yeah. And I said, it was like it was right there in front of me, and sometimes something can be right there in front of you and so obvious, and maybe it's because you just don't see it. And Kevin was very smart that way, and he said, this is going to get bad and really bad hopefully before it, I hope it doesn't go under. And I remember saying, well, the first priority we have to have is, I'm okay, because I was salaried and I think I had a contract. And I said to Kevin, I need to get you a contract so that you have some security too. And so I pushed with the girl who was doing the contracts, who knew nothing about the wrestling business. She was buying everything that Bischoff said to her, hook, line, and sinker. And so I went to her and I said, "Kevin is so important." And I said, we need to get that done and get him under contract before somebody comes and steals him away. Oh yes, and so we high speed railed that, got Kevin, and then once Kevin had the contract, if they wanted to jerk him around, okay, then I'll go home and sit home if that's what you want me to do. But my check's still coming in the mail every week.
Right.
Kevin, when you were booking the NWO, was there ever any thought of having the Horsemen take out the NWO? Because it was always the NWO's getting the advantage. Was there ever any kind of thought of maybe bringing back the Horsemen to prominence?
Here's the thing. The Horsemen, and James and I think alike in this. The Horsemen were baby faces at the time.
Yeah.
James and I saw, especially myself, and I've said this publicly before. I was in Charlotte the night Hogan, Kevin, Scott, and Kid laid down for the Four Horsemen. And they did the job in the middle of the ring. It was the Four Horsemen and Piper.
And Kevin Green.
Yeah, the thing, and I don't know if Kevin Green was in that match. Maybe you're right. But the thing was, by this time, Flair interviews were the most entertaining. Arn Anderson doesn't get the credit he deserves. His interviews are riveting, and his work is solid. Tully Blanchard he was excellent at his crying heel jag, and then you had Barry Windham, who was the matinee idol. And then you had James to talk for them, and they lived the gimmick. And after a while, when it doesn't matter how much they hate you, if you keep on piling the heat on, eventually they become the hottest baby faces. So they were the hottest baby faces we had. And James and I had talked about this, and I got this from James. They were really the only stopgap from the NWO taking over WCW, because one of the things I went to James with, I don't know if he remembers this, they were actually thinking about changing the show from WCW to NWO. Do you remember that, James?
Vaguely, yeah.
They were gonna have whoever wins, this, when they had added all these guys, a 7, like World Series, best 4 out of 7. And I said, they can't do that because, then where do we go from there? But the Horsemen with the stopgap to save WCW.
Yeah. Flair beats Bischoff and kind of wins back Nitro, and obviously becomes the commissioner, whatever, the president of WCW. They do end up saving it for a bit. I was just always thinking that the NWO kind of overshadowed the Horsemen, and in retrospect, Horsemen may be the greatest faction of all time. Obviously older at this point, talking about the Horsemen of the 80s and the NWO of the 90s, a little bit different, but still. The NWO was definitely a force to be reckoned with, and your booking was great with the NWO. There's no doubt about that.
Well, the thing is, and I think, again, James learned this from Eddie. Eddie, and I want to ask you this question, James, because, John, when there was all those territories, most of them owned by wrestlers, and they stayed on top way too long, whether it be our dear friend, the Sheik, Vern. I mean, you could go
Bob Geigel,
O'Connor. You could go down the list. The only one that got out early was Eddie. And Eddie knew that, Florida was supposed to be a wrestling territory. It was wrestling on the bottom, but it was blood and guts that drew the money. And Eddie believed in heat. And he believed in heat drew money. And a few people would say to me, don't you think this is getting too one-sided? And I'd go to James, and James would say, no, eventually the babyface is going to go over, but we're riding a wave here that we never had before. And then all of a sudden, pop, up pops Goldberg. So if you got the heat, you can draw. It's much harder to get heels over if they're losing. And that's going back to the original story we talked about was Rick complaining to JJ when they were in Charlotte about losing his heat. All heels are pretty giving, but they understand they have to get the heat back.
But the formula can work so well for so long if the heel does the job and then immediately there's an aftermath, gets the heat back, and the people are, you lost the match. The baby faces got their hands raised, but the chaos that followed it, that if you ask the people on the way out, well, who won the main event? I don't know, but they ought to kill those son of a bitches. That was the whole key to it.
Yeah.
Get their hand raised, and it was like, okay, well, hey, the baby faces went over, yeah, but but was important.
And I think that is a great stopping point, because I feel like we could probably go on forever with you guys talking about territories and talking about Graham and Dusty. So I just wanted to kind of wrap it up. Kevin, what's your final thoughts on JJ? You said he was a great wrestler. You said he was a great mind for the business. Said he was a great booker. What's your final thoughts on JJ?
Well, this is a little known fact when there was territories, right? The managers were the chick magnets. And I never figured that out. It must have been what they wore. JJ, I mean, Arn Innocent has, and I can't say it, the greatest nickname in the world for James. Paul Jones, Mr. Number One. Humperdinck of all people. I mean, whatever they have, these guys have the whole package. And it's been my pleasure to know my dear friend as long as I have, and I really appreciate you coming on the show, James. Thank you.
Well, our friendship is genuine. It was really saddened the last day or two, the last day with the passing of Laurinaitis, the animal. He was. I had the big hump here where at the War Games I was on his shoulder and Hawk came off, and I tried to get down and out and came down and nearly broke my neck and buried my shoulder. And so every morning when I get up, brush my teeth, look in the mirror, there's the reminder, and I think of Joe, and I was really sad. He's 60 years old, way too young to die, and he was a tremendous performer, credit to our business, and he was my friend.
Yeah, he was my friend too, and I talked to him 2 days before, and he was a great guy. Great. I got great stories of working against them, and they were just terrific, and it's what you're getting to see, John. How old are you now, John, if you don't mind?
38.
Brother, you should have a lifetime, but as you start to get the age, you see you have more sand in the bottom of your hourglass than you do on top.
Yeah.
You start to realize the most precious thing you have is those pieces of sand on top. So don't waste them. So, if you have somebody you love, you got to tell them you love them. JJ, I love you.
I love you too.
And I think we're all going to miss Joe. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
For sure. R.I.P. Joe Laurinaitis, the Animal, one of the greatest tag teams of all time, the Road Warriors, no doubt about that. Great guy too. I knew him personally. Awesome guy. So JJ, thank you so much for all the time today. It's been awesome. Great trip down memory lane.
Yeah.
With your old buddy Kevin Sullivan. Awesome.
Yeah, we go back a long way, and we got a friendship that's as genuine as it gets. And
yeah. And John, I'm not going to tell you about the mirror, how the guy used to tilt the mirror to JJ in the back seat, but that's another story. Okay. It's safe with me, James. It's safe with me. I'm taking it to my grave.
Oh God. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, JJ.
Thank you, and it's been an honor to spend this time. And you know, Kevin and I we could go on forever, never run out of stories. And Kevin Sullivan is one of the treasures of our business, and I'm proud and happy to also call him my friend.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
Thank you. Thank you, JJ. Yep.
Thanks,
I just want to say, I just want to say one final thing. The plugs, just throw them out there. You can follow us on Twitter at 2-Man Power Trip, and then on Instagram also at 2-Man Power Trip. You can follow Kevin on Instagram at Taskmaster Talks. You can go to his Pro Wrestling Tees store. Just go to prowrestlingtees.com and type in Kevin Sullivan. You can also go to his another t-shirt store, Double Hell T-shirts, and check it out. That's where you got some really, really good stuff. Double Hell, right, Kevin? That's where the good stuff is.
I got some really good T-shirts on that site, and John, you're going to be getting some in the mail.
Oh, nice.
I got this week, and they're terrific. You're going to laugh at some of them. And thank you again, John.
Yes, and thank you everybody for joining us this week and every week right here on Taskmaster Talks with Kevin Sullivan. See you next week, folks.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, and click the subscribe button to not miss any of our latest shoot interviews, match videos, or news updates. Support us on patreon.com for $1.99 a month to watch our full shoot interviews ad-free and help our channel grow. Follow us on Twitter at the Hannibal TV for instant updates.